Hello, happy June. Happy Wednesday, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lemick. I'm the founder and CEO of the Wounded Workforce. And I am so grateful to have such an amazing panel pulled together today to talk about a really important topic and a topic near and dear to my heart, supporting survivors, and specifically thinking about how we can support survivors in the workplace. So I will go ahead and kick off with introductions, and we'll go ahead and go clockwise on my camera, and I will have Christy introduce herself first. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you. Stephanie, so great to be here. And so looking forward to this conversation. It's a tough topic, but certainly looking forward to this critical conversation we're having. So I'm Christy Palutic. I have worked in the construction industry for the past 20 years or so, really on the people employee experience side. And most recently leading a startup, BuilderFacts, to really focus on our craft workforce and help them own their career in ways that they've never been able to.
Amazing. Very cool. Great to have you back.
Yeah.
Jennifer.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Jennifer Laurie. I use they, them, and she, her pronouns, and I am the Chief People Officer at StartOut. We're a nonprofit that supports LGBTQ plus entrepreneurs, and I do some equity consulting as well. So really happy to be here to talk about this topic as well. Happy to be here.
Amazing. So grateful to have you here. Jessica W. I have two Jessicas on. I always do this.
I love that. Hi, Jessica Winder, the founder of Hidden Gem Career Coaching. And I do, now I say I own a law practice. I don't. My husband does, but I'm doing all the stuff for him. So I think that I'm a lawyer, but I am not. So I'm excited to have this conversation today.
Amazing. And Jessica D.
Yes, the second of the Jessicas. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Donahue. I am the founder of Adjunct Leadership Consulting. I am a fractional people leader. So I have been consulting with startups now for the past 4 years in a fractional capacity. Before that, spent about a decade in corporate HR, and very happy to be here today.
Amazing. Jessica D is also the very first person who got certified
That's right.
as a certified trauma-informed workplace practitioner. So super excited to have you on and share more of your thoughts, your story around this as well. And of course, as always, I am here to help guide the panel, and then we'll chime in on occasion with my thoughts as well. I do want to offer a little bit of a content warning for our listeners today. While, we do cover challenging topics in our panel discussion, because we're going to be talking about survivors and survivors' experience, this might be something that isn't the right thing for you to watch right now. So keep that in mind. Be aware we may be talking about traumatic experiences in a little more detail than we typically do on other panels. So want you to know that before we dive in. And always, always, always make sure you're taking care of your mental health first and foremost. Before we dive into questions, I love to start from a place of shared understanding. So I want to share a little bit about what we're talking about today and why it's important. As we look to build trauma-informed workplace cultures, an important aspect is acknowledging and supporting survivors of trauma. By creating supports and avoiding re-traumatization, we can create better, safer workplaces for everyone. And in some cases, by creating a positive, empowering experience in the workplace, we can even help survivors in their healing journey. I do want to offer a quick note on terminology. This is a passion of mine on why we use survivor versus victim. Survivor reflects a broader understanding of the impact of trauma and the importance in language when we look at healing. It also recognizes the resilience and agency of individuals, promotes a positive and empowering narrative, and aligns with the preferences of many who have experienced trauma. So this is why when we talk about people who have survived traumatic experiences, we elect to use the term survivor versus the term victim. So just want to share that as well. So let's go ahead and dive in and get started with our questions. And whoever would like to kick us off, go ahead and chime in. But our first question is, why is this topic important to you, whether it's, supporting survivors in general or supporting survivors specifically in the workplace?
I'll go ahead and get us going. So for me, I support partners that are survivors themselves. My husband is a survivor of childhood sexual abuse, parental neglect, and my daughter is also a survivor of sexual assault when she was a child. And so being able to support them and create resources and trusting environment is important, not just for me personally in the day-to-day, but also translating that once you start looking at some of the statistics and understanding what you don't know, right, and what's out there is just a critical thing that we can do to be good people, really.
Yeah, I can chime in too. I'm coming at this from like an HR perspective. So I have been the HR or the head of HR at two different organizations where one, we had an employee who was actively being stalked and we had to try to protect her. And then the second time we had someone who was going through domestic violence and like trying to be their HR person and what that meant, what it meant for me, what it meant for the business. I don't know that I've ever been through anything like it. I hope to never go through it again, but I know the resources now and I know what to do. And at the time, I did not know what I was doing, to be quite honest. I was really early in my HR career. I myself was literally walking her to her car, which was also not safe for me. So, there's so much to unpack there, but I just think it's so important to even think about it from a business standpoint. I'm like, what are you doing? Do you have policies? Do people know the policies? Like, has anyone ever had to deal with it before?
Yeah, and I'm coming at it from kind of a personal and professional angle today. So professionally, obviously, as a people person, I'm tasked in my day-to-day work with how do we take care of our people? How do we set them up for success? How do we create a work environment where they can, bring their best work? I'm also a complex trauma survivor myself. I have kind of a history of abuse and neglect from childhood in my background. And as I have grown older and have gone through my own kind of healing journey, which I'm very much still on, I've kind of come to this crossroads of my personal healing and my professional day-to-day, what I do for a living, very much kind of coming to an intersection. And I see so clearly now, based on all of my own learning, how our trauma histories can show up at work. And I want to be part of that solution. So kind of a dual approach from me today.
Yeah, and I would say it's important to me. I myself am a survivor of sexual violence, and both in and outside of the workplace. And I've personally experienced the profound impact that work and work environment can have on a survivor's well-being. I've been in workplaces where I felt really supported and safe, and I was able to contribute and perform well and just thrive and heal in the workplace and out of the workplace. And then I've also been in work environments where support was really lacking and the harm was exacerbated. It affected my ability to perform at work and engage, and also just my overall mental health and healing journey. So for me, based on my own experience and working with other survivors, I've seen that a supportive workplace is not just preference or sort of a nice to have, but it's really essential for healing and empowerment. And I think it's everyone's responsibility to sort of create that environment, especially leaders and HR folks and managers. And so, yeah, I'm really passionate about helping people, equipping people to be able to do that.
So Jennifer, what you just said, I have to say, like, it sparked something that I had not even thought about in years. But I myself, like, almost was choked by an employee during a termination meeting. And this was super early in my career. I literally had to end up going to the hospital because I like hurt my head and like all of this stuff. But I had never even thought about it as trauma, like never even crossed my mind. But this was something that absolutely happened to me, that I was in a termination meeting, and to be honest, I was not protected in the way that I should have been. They did not have reinforcements. I should never have been in that meeting by myself, but I was. And the employee got mad and literally tried to choke me. So yeah, the workplace can also be dangerous. I want to say that.
Absolutely. I mean, Thank you all for sharing, really personal stories. I think this is, I cannot imagine a better group to have to have this conversation. So grateful to each of you. I want to start with, what are some common challenges that we can think about when we think about, the workplace specifically, and how challenges show up for survivors of trauma or abuse, or individuals who are actively experiencing abuse potentially.
I think it's the lack of knowledge. When I was in the situation, when we had an employee, she came forward and she said, "I'm actively in a stalking situation." There are so many statistics behind like people getting seriously hurt or killed going to work because that is somewhere they must go daily, that the person who is stalking them can find them. I had known this information. And I remember talking to the leadership team, and they're just like, well, what are we supposed to do? That was their response. Like, what are we supposed to do? And I'm like, well, one, we have a duty to keep her safe here. Now, this situation was public facing. So people could come in and out of the building. It wasn't like a lockdown situation where we could, like, stop people's key cards or stuff like that. Like, it was public facing. So this individual that was stalking her, we found on camera that had come to the property many, many times. And so it was like, okay, well, ban him, but what does that mean? And so I truly don't believe that our leadership team, one, knew what they were doing. Um, Two, had any sense of like the state of like trauma and like mental anguish that this person was actively in coming to work every day. And like how that would impact her performance. Like, okay, she is scared to leave the building. So of course she is not actively performing. She does not feel safe here. And so there were so many things that happened that I remember thinking, we are doing this all wrong. And then I felt the need as the HR person to be like, well, I'm going to take it on and I'm going to, save her. And that became in itself something for me, because I would be like trying to meet her at the gate in the morning to make sure she was safe. And like, what does that mean for me? And, so there was just so many things that were not planned out. That's what I will say. Where no one planned it out. No one thought of it. It was just like, oh, we'll just figure it out.
Yeah, I think kind of piggybacking off of that a little bit, another kind of angle I could come at this from is just talking a little bit about the power dynamics that exist in the workplace, right? They do, whether we want them there or not. And I think just coming at it through my experience, complex trauma in childhood, I think particularly in the workplace, employee manager relationships, when you have maybe a history of abuse, particularly parental, can very much be reminiscent of a parent-child relationship. And anytime there's kind of that unbalanced kind of yielding of power, that can be very activating for someone like myself. I can, even as I'm talking about it, like I can feel kind of that like pit in my stomach and like shakiness a little bit in me. So I think just kind of going off of what the other Jessica was saying also is just like, when you haven't lived it, when you haven't been through it, you can only see things through your own lens. And that's true for all of us. But how do we kind of help leaders at companies start to kind of broaden their perspective to understand, just because you haven't experienced this doesn't mean someone else on this team isn't in it right now or hasn't experienced it in the past. And so just kind of acknowledging that we might not have experience with it, that doesn't mean someone else's experience with it is not very, very real for them.
One of the other challenges that I think we face in the workforce, and Jessica Donahue to use some of the language you used in your introduction, is that the journey that trauma survivors are on, every survivor is on their own journey, and that's not entirely a linear line either. So let's just be mindful of that. And with that, there's often, not always, but often shame talking about the past and what trauma and what impacts they could be. So Jessica Winder, you even talked about like the person that you had that wasn't performing. We may have folks in our workplaces that aren't performing. It may or may not be trauma related. and they may or may not be willing to come forward and even talk about, hey, here's what's going on now. So some of that shame, some of those unknowns that, you know, hide behind the curtains of trauma in general, right, happens so often that, you know, even we see these challenges at the workplace, but we don't even realize that they're trauma based or that there's any rooting there in the trauma space at all to begin with. So pile on top of the challenges that come from that, but just knowing that things are happening that we don't even know about and folks aren't comfortable sharing for lots of different reasons.
I think another challenge is just like navigating the mental load that comes with being a trauma survivor and, you know, managing trauma responses and triggers. And yeah, that looks very different for every individual. And there's no sort of one way that survivors behave. And so I think living with triggers can feel like kind of a minefield every day, everywhere you are. But at work, it can be really like vulnerable and really hard to navigate when something pops up that you're just not expecting, or yeah, that you deal with differently than people might expect you to in the workplace, and not in a professional way, or not in a way that they might respond to it. And so I think that's just a really additional kind of mental load that comes with dealing with trauma, that doing that while also just trying to get your job done and have relationships at work is really challenging.
Absolutely. How can employers, whether it's at an organizational level or at a leadership and manager level, what work can they do to better understand what trauma survivors may be going through, or what supports trauma survivors may need from them?
Take your course or no?
I'll accept the free shameless plug. Thank you.
I'm like,
Okay, yes.
I mean, it's there. It's right there. Take the course.
Jessica, so I'll be honest, I haven't, Stephanie, taken your course yet, but Jessica, I think you, like, what you're talking about is become educated, right? To learn themselves. For me, to be honest, I had looked to my husband in particular to help teach me about what it's like to be a survivor and what he might need. And gosh dang it, that's not unfair, right? Like, he's navigating his journey of like all of this as well. And then he has to inform me right? And to figure out how to do things. Shame on me. Okay, lesson learned, right? But so for leaders out there in the world, educate yourself, right? Understand what impacts could be, what, you know, how to create a safe space, build some of those relationships to create conversations where you can create that supportive and great environment. So courses like what Stephanie's offering, and, you know, I'm sure there's some other resources that'll come up that we can talk about, of ways that people can educate themselves so that they can come to the table informed to support their organization and the people they've got working for them.
Even being willing to say the word. I can think of most of the leadership teams that I have been a part of. If you were to come into a meeting talking about trauma, for me, as the head of HR, I would be shut down very quickly. So the ability to even speak about what might be going on, or use the word trauma or use the word survivor in the place of work, would be step one. I can see several ways that this could go south, or I have seen it myself, where you bring up stuff like this and it is not well received.
Yeah, I think sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Jessica.
one thing I would just kind of layer onto that, and it's such a hard question, because truly, and a couple of us have spoken to this, it's so unique, like how the very nature of trauma, like, is that the same exact thing could happen to me, same exact thing could happen to someone next to me. We might experience it and have ramifications after the fact that are very different from one another. So I think the biggest thing that comes to mind when I think about, you know, how can employers better understand, better support, believe your people. You know, if someone says they're struggling with something personal, believe them. Like, how many times have I talked to a manager who wants to terminate someone for performance, and, you know, their whole point of view is, well, this person's just saying that because they're not good at their job, they're not performing, you know, they're making an excuse. It's like, well, what if they're not? You know, what do we really have to lose by giving people the benefit of the doubt and taking them at their word. I think believing people, if it's a big if, they choose to kind of share what they're going through, what they're dealing with, is like the number one thing that we can do to start.
Yeah, I would also say just promoting kind of a culture of psychological safety and open communication, because again, every survivor is going to have very different needs. And so it's about creating a space where people can ask for what they need. People can sort of say, hey, I need support. They may or may not disclose, the details of what they're going through, but even still just being able to have someone come forward and say, I need more flexible schedule, or, I need to not be like on the website right now because I'm dealing with stalking, or, whatever the case may be. Just having the space for people to be able to have those conversations with their managers, with HR teams, I think is really, really critical.
I love that. I think it's so important because it's hard to, like, when you're navigating all of this, how do you find the way to like bring it, if you have to bring it into the workplace because, well, it's coming with you everywhere. How can you make it easier for folks to navigate that, to say, hey, can I be taken off the website for a certain amount of time? And then I'm a big believer. So I'm a trauma survivor, and I'm here I am doing all this trauma work. I don't actually openly disclose and share my trauma. Um, and I think that that is something that is important for us all to respect as well, is that it's always up to a survivor how and when they disclose. So that can make it, again, more challenging because someone may not be willing to share, but there should still be ways within your culture, within your processes, through psychological safety, to provide that support without asking someone to share something they're not comfortable with. So I love what you all have shared. Also, Jessica W, like, I want to like triple click on, people do not want to talk about trauma at work. People do not want to say the term survivor, because as I started this work with the wounded workforce, almost all of the feedback I got was, call it something else, do something different, reframe this, because people aren't comfortable talking about trauma. And that's exactly why we do talk about trauma.
Yeah.
So to kind of piggyback on some of what we've already talked about, and how we might know that someone needs our support, needs our help. Obviously, there is someone discloses to you that they need support and they're offering their experiences. But I noted, for me, I'm not someone who is willing to share my traumatic experiences. And I certainly would not have done it in the workplace, in previous lives. So, what are some signs you can look for, or kind of, you know, red flags or yellow flags, so to speak, that a peer, an employee might be experiencing trauma or might need additional support from you?
I would say it's less about signs, because I don't want to encourage people to sort of be like monitoring each other's behavior and making assumptions. I think it comes from a great place. Like, there are definitely some telltale signs of trauma. I think it is helpful to understand how trauma behaves and what it looks like. But I would say more than anything, again, just being open, like being someone who is empathetic and trusting and able to have conversations with folks so that they come to you. But one thing that I think is helpful is, like, if you notice a change in behavior in someone, just checking in, like, hey, I noticed, you've been like a little more reserved lately, or, you've been like out a little bit. Just want to make sure you're doing okay. Like, I'm here if you ever need to talk, not prodding too much on like, I noticed you haven't been here. Why haven't you been here? Tell me about what's going on. Are you experiencing trauma? Right. But like, just being open and checking in, letting them know that you're there and that, there are supports available if they need them, I think is really helpful.
I think you have like a mic drop there, Jen.
Yeah, I was like, yes, what Jennifer said.
Right. Underscore that. Like, I think in addition, one of the other things that people can do as well is it's asking the question, right? It's having that observation and noticing if you start to see those changes in behavior, particularly if something out in the world is happening that may reactivate someone, right? For example, a school shooting, right? I've known survivors of school shootings in the past. And so, unfortunately, they happen or have happened, right, in the past. And so just being mindful of those comes up, and and there's lots of things that could be activating for someone who's experienced trauma themselves, and just be a little bit mindful of some of those things that are going on out in the world, and how that might impact and change behavior of folks you've got working for you as well. And then to underscore again what Jennifer talked about is check in with them. Hey, I noticed, you kind of stepped out of the room when that was come up on the news. Or, hey, I noticed, is there anything you want to talk about? I'm here if you do. Right?
Yeah, creating space, right? It's all about creating space for someone to share if and when they want to. And they may not, but the fact that you cared enough to, one, notice, to two, say, hey, how you doing? Everything okay? Just want to check in on you. I really think, like, you've seen it time and time again working in HR. Like, I think as a leader, those kinds of things go so far with our people that we don't even really truly understand how far they go. But those are the behaviors, the actions that build trust within a team and between humans. So yeah, great point.
I love what you mentioned too about social media or the news. Kind of, I am a big believer that constantly being inundated by others' trauma, for some people who are survivors, absolutely can be triggering, but for many of us, it can also just create secondary trauma or even compassion fatigue from that constant kind of just earth-shattering experiences, very visible and very accessible all the time. And I know during the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, one thing I started to do was very visibly, as a leader, taking a beat or taking a moment or taking a day when something upsetting in the news happened, and kind of sharing that with my team, like, hey, this, really got me off focus. I'm not feeling like I can move forward. Know that that stands for you, regardless of what it is too. And it's modeling that, oh my gosh, like, I need to get off this meeting. Like, I can't deal with this conversation. And also, whatever terrible thing is going on in the world, or even just in my own life. And I think by modeling that, we show that it's okay. And then folks get more comfortable as well. That's something I found that has been super helpful. And people don't have to disclose in those moments as well. It's not like, oh, you need to take a half a day? Well, tell me for 15 minutes why, because I need all your personal information, because we don't. So I want to talk a little bit about culture as it relates to survivors, and how the culture of a workplace, culture of an organization, what role does it play in supporting survivors? And, do you personally have any examples, or even if you just have like a perfect picture in your mind of what a strong supportive culture would look like for survivors of trauma?
I think a theme that stands out to me, it's not a specific necessarily, but this is something I've been thinking a lot about in my work right now and lately, especially this year, is finding ways where we can build choice in at like every turn. So giving people options, not making things mandatory, trying to maybe cater to almost like different groups of preferences. I think choice can be really empowering, and a lot of times trauma took away choice for a lot of us. And so anytime we're feeling like we're forced into something, that can be really activating again. So trying to find little ways where you can, give people options and choice and not be, mandating left and right, I think is key.
I think it's So I have a lot of feelings about the culture. So I think it's all well and good to have an amazing culture at a company, but if the culture on a specific team or with a specific manager is not well, or however, whatever word you want to use there, for anyone, specifically a survivor, it's all downhill. So I truly believe there's something to be said about like management training or like understanding or empathy and all of those words that you would use right there, because the situation that I was speaking about earlier, where someone was in a domestic abuse situation, we had a culture of like psychological safety in broader, but this specific sales team did not have that. And it was clear to everyone in the company that they did not have that. So this person went through this situation for quite a while before anyone ever even acknowledged it. Mind you, this was a remote environment. So it wasn't like, she didn't have to be on camera, so it wasn't like we were physically seeing her. And that added to it. But the culture with this manager also added, I think it added to her trauma because she could not speak up. She, it was basically, you need to be making sales, and it doesn't, what's going on in your personal life is like not our business. Was something that the manager actually told her. So it's great to have a great company culture, but if you don't have that culture with your leaders, then you can throw it all out the window.
Yeah, Jessica, just to underscore that a little bit, the direct manager has the single biggest impact of anyone else in the organization on an employee's experience. No matter what leaders are sitting in a room talking about culture, speaking from the pulpit, mirroring, like demonstrating all those behaviors, all that good things, right? That individual direct supervisor has a single biggest impact. And allowing folks on the team to behave in a way that doesn't align to the culture that you want to deliberately create, then you are therefore deliberately undermining the culture that you're trying to create. And with that, no matter how much money they might be bringing in, which is so often I've heard as the excuse, right? Like, you've got to hold those folks accountable, not just to operational revenue or whatever it is that they're doing, but as well as to maintaining that culture that you're hopefully working so hard to foster within the organization.
Plus one to all three, all the things that are shared. One thing that's specific that I would add is just, I think, creating a culture of acceptance and openness around violence and trauma and survivorship. It goes a really long way. And I think, just getting rid of that stigma, making people feel like this is something I can talk about, or like, I know that this is something that my organization is supportive of me navigating, or just getting the support that I need within the workplace, even if within a team or they don't know exactly where to go. Like, it just still helps, I think, create an environment where survivors feel a little bit safer and more comfortable just even existing, even if they don't like need anything or have any accommodation requests. It just feels a little bit safer and more supportive, which I think is really impactful.
I love that. I love that. So I heard someone else say this, and I told them I was going to steal it. And I am. And I think we should all steal it because I love it. I don't know how many times I have been, working on a team, working with a team, adjacent to a team that's like, let's get in and workshop our core values, and like, let's post our core values on our website, like core values, man. And it's how the culture actually is. It's like the actual experience of every day. And I heard another coach frame this to someone is, if you're going to bother doing this core values work, this core values brainstorm workshop, the first thing you should think is a violation of our core values is a terminable offense to anyone in the organization. And I was like, that's the game. Like, I love that framing because that is a game changer.
Yeah.
And he said, like, because otherwise it's not really a value.
Mm-hmm.
And I love dialing up that sense of extremeness, because I think so many of us kind of referenced in our answers, yes, cultures are great, but like, what happens on that
Yes.
manager level, or what happens on the day to day? And like, I'll raise my hand and say, I've had really terrible experiences, like triggering experiences in my career, because there was someone violating core values or principles and they weren't held accountable because, exactly like you said, Christy, how much money they were making.
Yeah.
And it's also just like really devastating for someone who's bought into an organization or bought into a team to then have that experience as well.
Yeah. I think what you're saying, when I think of like core values or like the culture in general, I always think of what are people being rewarded for? So who's getting promoted, or what are people being fired for? That tells me everything I need to know about your culture. I don't care about what you wrote on the wall. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, what are people being promoted for and what are they being fired for? And that tells me everything about your culture.
Jessica, you so often you walk into someone's office, right, and you see their core values on a wall, or they put it on their website, and that's all cute and sweet and fun.
Yeah, it's cute.
Right? We're like, yeah, that means nothing. And also, there's a bit of question mark, like, okay, what does that actually mean?
Yes.
Right? I mean, how many organizations core value is people? Really? Like, what? Tell me what the heck that means. Right?
Ethics. Yeah, Enron had that too.
I was like, to give a best practice, right? I was in, or like a good like approach. I was in one of our early adopters offices just a few weeks ago, and I carved out a little bit of time, was in a conference room, and on their wall in a conference room, yep, on the wall, was a list of kind of what their core values and what was important to them. And then right next to it, like in the next column, it was, okay, here's what this looks like. And then here's what this does not look like. That's so good. Anybody could come, and it's not just like ethics, right? But here's what ethics looks like. Here's what's not. So if people are creating a psychologically safe environment is important to the organization, here's what that looks and sounds like. And here's what that doesn't look and sound like. Right? So you get to see both sides of that. And I was like, brilliant. Took a picture, and right?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
I want to see that picture, Christy. So, to think, really like tactically for, leaders, HR professionals on the call, what are some effective policies, procedures, processes that organizations can implement to help support survivors, to really kind of change the game for survivors' experience at work? Whether it's, in the near term, they could institute this policy today, or, maybe do a little bit of work over the course of the next few months to really make sure there are things set up so survivors have more support built into the workplace.
I love like a designated policy, and it can be something that contains kind of a lot. So like an anti-violence policy, but contains specific provisions for survivors of violence as well. So it's kind of like in the workplace, we're against violence. This is what that looks like, but also we protect people who have experienced violence and we provide provisions for them. Half of US states have some requirement for paid leave for survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence. The FMLA sometimes comes into play here too, but regardless of what the kind of like legal standards are, I recommend having some sort of a designated survivor leave and kind of provisions policy. And, that can be time off for like, legal proceedings, or even just to like move into a safer space, or sometimes it's intermittent leave to take extra time for therapy than what may be allotted in your other leave policies. And even if people don't use it that often, like it may feel like maybe not a necessary policy, it goes a really long way just to have something that you can point people to that has like a very clear statement of, we're here to support you. These are some ways that might look, but also please reach out to us if you need other support. So I think having a policy like that is really like important and imperative for creating that safety for survivors.
I think another thing that organizations can do is take a look at their benefits, particularly their mental health, right? So often you hear, oh, we've got a great EAP. The statistics on EAP usage is dismal, right? And it takes like 15 clicks to get someone on the other end of the line. Great starting point, fine, but you can do more, right? So what other additional resources can you add to really create a more robust offering when it comes to mental health benefits for folks navigating their survivor journey, for folks navigating other mental health challenges or substance abuse issues and things like that, right? But take a look at what your offerings are, and can you do better? Chances are you can like up that at least a little bit, right?
Yeah, so I would say, I'm going to take this a different way, but I would say stop defunding DE&I, because people need a sense of community. And so I'll just give an example of this. So at my last organization, one of the, many shootings of Black and brown people happened. And the leadership team, myself, like leading the way, said, hey, we're going to send out a message and we're going to say like, hey, if you've been impacted by this, like, obviously even myself, I could not watch the footage, but it was enough to know that this was horrible. Then take whatever you need, take some time off. Here's resources that you need for mental health, all these things. And I say stop defunding DEI because if you don't have these things, how do people feel a sense of community? One. And then two, if you are a survivor, but there's no like avenue for you to be different, then what does that mean for your organization? So I see DEI being encompassing of so many things that like, if you stop defunding this and you say this is no longer important, we're going to, DEI, is going to sit over here and be its own little thing now, but no one's going to really do anything about it. That tells me all that I need to know about being a survivor wherever I am. And what does that actually mean? So that example is the perfect example of at no other organization would I have been able to say, if you have been impacted by what you just saw on the news, take some time off. That would have never been okay. So that is an example of like truly living that you say you care about DEI, then truly care about it. And that can go for school shootings. That can go for anything. This just happened to be the shooting of a Black person. But, so I think you can't have it both ways. You can't say you care about DEI and then defund it. And it can't be a dirty word either. Like, don't even get me started on that part, but yeah.
Well, that's like our next podcast. I think it's really important, and I try to be pretty outspoken about this. In my mind, being a trauma survivor is an aspect of diversity.
Mhm.
It is a diverse experience. It is part of the suitcase I bring with me to the workplace. And if you are saying you care about supporting trauma survivors, if you care about being a trauma informed organization, but you don't care about DE&I, that doesn't work.
Mhm.
It's important, and I love that you went that direction because it's so true. We have to showcase an appreciation and an attempt at understanding of all these different lived experiences, which includes race, gender, religion. It also includes traumatic experiences. So I love that example you shared, Jessica, because I think it is a perfect showcase of, yes, these things are interconnected and for very important reasons.
Mhm.
I would add too that like survivorship is an intersectional identity, like all identities are, but
Yeah.
it affects every community, every identity group. I think the stats are like people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus folks, low income people, and women are like more are targeted at higher rates for sexual harm, like violence, hate crimes, just general assault. And so it affects so many groups that I think like I would love to see more like ERGs coming together to host a panel on like anti-violence or even just like bringing survivor voices or survivor leaders in to host, like trainings or things like that. I totally agree that it is a part of DEI initiatives and should be a part of our definition of diversity, and would love to see it more integrated into those conversations.
I don't know how the hour always goes by so fast, but again, we've gone by so quickly. This has been an amazing conversation. Thank you all so much for your insights and for sharing your stories. To wrap up, I would love to have each of you share any resources. So if there's something you read, a resource that you really relate to, for folks who want to learn more or maybe do more as it relates to supporting survivors or just understanding trauma in general, especially as it relates to the workplace. And we'll go counterclockwise this time. So Jessica D, you can go ahead and kick us off first.
Yes. So many wonderful books that I've read on the topic, but one that I think would be really great if you're looking to just kind of understand more about trauma and its impacts is a book called What Happened to You. It was actually written in conjunction, Oprah and Dr. Bruce Perry, who Everything the man says is gold. It's so fascinating and interesting. That's a really great book to just kind of start to understand how different lived experiences may impact people and their trauma histories throughout life in a really, really digestible, almost like storytelling kind of a format. So that's a really good one.
Love that
Okay, I
one.
want to
The
be
audiobook
skipped.
is excellent. No, you
Yeah,
want to
come
be
back to me. It
skipped?
was like, come back to me just because I thought of the book, but now I got to find the name.
Okay, all right. Jennifer.
I have one resource that I love that talks, I think like one of the most valuable things is just understanding trauma behavior, trauma responses, the diversity of what that looks like for different people. So there's a resource from an organization called Mind. They're a mental health nonprofit in the UK. And yeah, they talk about different types of trauma responses, like just how it kind of interacts with the brain, what it looks like in practice, that I think is really helpful if you're trying to better understand that. And then second one, I would say, I just mentioned the anti-violence leave that kind of provides provisions for survivors. And I have a template policy on that. So happy to share that resource as well.
Amazing. That's great. Christy.
Yeah. Underscore and +1 for What Happened to You. Big fan of that book. The other book I'd recommend is Allies in Healing by Laura Davis. Another good storytelling, helping folks kind of navigate through trauma, understanding kind of the different impacts of that. And I'm adding another one, shameless plug for this podcast, right? And the conversations that Stephanie's bringing up is that, tackling different aspects of trauma and things you can do in bite-sized chunks, right? And so if you're not, follow and subscribe, right? But I mean, Stephanie, you're doing great work around this topic and around this conversation. So I think for anyone listening, that if this is your first time, keep tuning in, right? Stephanie does a really great job of looking at all sorts of different avenues of the topic and things that you can take away as a result from each conversation.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Christy. And Christy actually was a guest on my podcast in the early days, and we talked very specifically about supporting survivors in that conversation as well. So another awesome and free resource.
Hey.
I love that. So I looked behind me because I have a bookcase and I have all these crazy books over here, like amazing books. But the one that I wanted to say, it's called You Are Your Best Thing. And it's a book of a bunch of people of color that have written about their trauma, being survivors. What does it mean? Amazing book. I'll say it again. You Are Your Best Thing. Highly, highly recommend this book. Sounds silly, but my husband and I did it together as a book club and like talked about the different stories. I will absolutely say some of it is very raw, but it is an amazing book. And it talks about being a survivor and what does it mean in this world as a person of color. So highly, highly recommend the book.
Amazing. What great recommendations. Thank you all so very much. What a phenomenal conversation. A really vulnerable conversation. So I want to give extra thank you to each of you for participating. And thank you all for joining us and listening in. And look forward to chatting next month when we will be covering neuroplasticity. Thank you all so much. Bye.